Hi, everybody. I'm happy to welcome you to this exciting panel today. Thanks to everybody for coming. Um, uh, for those who don't know, maybe Dan's baby. No, I don't know Dan, but certainly the baby too. I'm John Master. I'm the director of the Emory College Language Center. And I just want to say that when the executive committee of the ECLC met for the first time this year, I think it was September, who knows? It's all a blur. But then, of course, the executive committee is composed of representatives of each language taught at Emory. When we met for the first time this year, it was immediately evident in that Zoom meeting the immense passion and desire to make Emory a truly inclusive community, an anti-racist community. And so this event today is like the very first step by faculty in foreign language toward realizing that goal. It will not be the last. We are committed to, at the ECLC, anyway, if I may speak for that group, but only that group, we're committed to sustained anti-racist action. And no one doubts that we, and perhaps some more than others, have a lot to learn and plenty of room to grow. But today marks a sort of an official start to our process. I'm going to hand off now to Christine Restaino, senior lecturer in Italian and the author of All the Silent Spaces, a memoir published in 2019 that confronts the topics of violence, identity, and discrimination. Christine Restaino has been a member of the Emory College faculty since the aughts. And in the decade that I have known her, she has devoted herself in an exemplary fashion to supporting social justice causes here. So, Christine, over to you.
Jonathan, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. And this is indeed one of the topics I'm the most passionate about. I'd love to introduce to you two of our two amazing speakers tonight. And I'll just provide a brief introduction. They will speak. And then after both of our speakers have spoken, I'll give a few preliminary comments for questions or comments as well. So our first speaker is Didem Yücel, and Dr. Yücel is an assistant professor in German studies. She received her PhD in Germanic languages and literatures from the University of Pennsylvania in 2019, and then spent 1 year as a visiting assistant professor of German at Colgate University. Her research interests center on the cultural production of minorities in German-speaking countries, intersectional approaches to migration, gender and sexuality studies, narratology, translation and multilingualism, and the Bildungsroman. Her dissertation was titled Coming of Age on the Move, Young Travelers, Migrants, and Refugees in 20th and 21st Century Literature in German. So I'd like to introduce a warm welcome or invite a warm welcome to Didem. We are all ears. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christine, for the introduction. And I realized about 10 minutes ago that I didn't send you one. So thank you for doing research on me. I really appreciate it. So yeah, I'm very grateful to be speaking today. And I just wanted to let you know that I wasn't feeling very well today. So if I seem a little lower energy than usual, then that's not a reflection of my lack of excitement at your questions and feedback. It's just human constraints. And as Christine mentioned, I did start at Emory this year, and I'm so grateful to be in the Department of German Studies, which has committed itself to doing work to really broaden how we define what German studies means today by creating this position that I was lucky enough to have. And I also want to acknowledge that there are many scholars, up and coming folks, graduate students, and young out of work PhDs who will not get an opportunity to have steady employment in academia, oftentimes because they are doing the very important type of work that is unacknowledged or thought of as not as important as some of the more traditional scholarships. So I just want to acknowledge that and sort of give that as an impulse for us who are here, who are lucky enough to have, hopefully stable and ongoing employment, to really take it upon ourselves to do this important work because we have that opportunity and we also have that responsibility. So with that being said, I'm going to read my talk for you now, and I'm also happy to make it available as a document so you don't have to feel like you're feverishly taking notes. And I'm happy also to clarify anything in the Q&A. So my talk is titled Something I Knew But Couldn't Name, Developing a Critical Vocabulary for the Anti-Racist Language Classroom. So today I will be sharing some classroom tips based on my experiences as a student and instructor of color in a majority white discipline. At the end of my presentation, I will also share additional resources that can offer further support and opportunity for reflection for all of you. I began learning German in my first semester of college and entered the classroom with little exposure to the language or culture outside of pieces we sang in my high school choir when I thought, man, this German language is absolutely terrible. I'm never going to be able to learn this. What is this thing? So naturally, first thing I did freshman year was sign up for German. And thus our relationship began, a very complex one. So having grown up in a bilingual household and speaking Turkish and English growing up and learning Italian in high school, I was really excited to be dedicating myself to learning new sounds, and I devoted countless hours on my dorm room whiteboard, learning the alphabet and learning all of the different pronunciations of the consonant combinations. So that first week was really exciting, but I also learned in that first week that there was a lot of racism towards Turkish people from within Germany, within German-speaking cultures. And I learned that because of a offhanded joke that my German teaching assistant made against Turkish people during class. So when I pointed out that I was Turkish, the TA said, "Oh, well, you're not like those Turks because you're seeking an education." So I didn't have the words for it at the time. I had just turned 18, was in my first week of college. But I knew that that type of exceptionalism made me really uncomfortable and would ultimately not protect me. So while this moment could have very rightfully sent me running out the door and switching my schedule, for whatever reason, it fueled me to learn German as well as I could in order to understand the Turkish diasporic community in Germany and their cultural contributions, especially as a Turkish American where I didn't really have a strong sense of Turkish diasporic identity in the US. It was actually through my engagement with German studies that I reconnected with my own heritage in a really roundabout sort of by proxy way. Long before entering the profession, I understood that choosing to be in the German classroom would mean dedicating my energy to the work of anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion, both as a means to facilitate my own safety and legibility and to ensure that students after me would have it better. And it was ironically through this early engagement with German studies that I began to learn more about my own cultural heritage. A lot of what I learned was not necessarily new to me. It was about learning how to articulate these implicit yet unspoken realities that took the form of acquiring a new language and with it a context for the experiences I knew but couldn't name. Turkish-German writer Emine Sevgi Özdamar gave me the language to describe the pain and pleasure, humor, and trauma of losing and finding tongues in the diaspora. Turkish-German filmmaker Fatih Akın showed me the visual language of longing, given and chosen families, of despair and of joy. Turkish-German rapper Dr. Bitre set that language of empowerment, resistance, and freedom to a beat. Yet there were also the languages of discrimination, violence, and appropriation. The medieval poet Walter von der Vogelweide and the German church reformer Martin Luther showed me that today's languages of fear and aggression toward those who practice Islam have deep historical roots. The Romantics taught me how prejudices could be couched, that's a divan joke, if you get it, okay, couched in the language of scholarly, aesthetic, and translation practices. And as Todd Contia quips in German Orientalisms, quote, that the Orient can always be appropriated for an Occidental masquerade, end quote. Turkish-German ultra-right-wing author Akif Pirinci taught me that there's also a language of disappointment. Not all who look like me are for me. As I endeavor to be the best German instructor I can be, I also reckon with contemporary frameworks of language policing that reveal how, exercises in German schools called Warum wir in der Schule Deutsch sprechen, or Why We Speak German in School, are far from innocuous. These are languages that I have learned alongside German, languages that have also helped me to communicate these experiences for the first time in English and Turkish. In my own teaching, I have centered these meta-languages from the earliest stages of acquisition and communication. This means helping students develop a critical eye towards the very materials that we are teaching them, that we are using to teach them the language and content of instruction. To name just one example, in my first semester of teaching as a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania in 2013, I noticed that the textbook we were using portrayed almost an exclusively white German cast of characters who were university students, with the sole Turkish German character portrayed as a truck driver, who also happened to have my father's name. So there was sort of this extra like knife twist there. So after speaking with my supervisor who supported my decision to remove this material from my section, I actually realized that it would be more effective to address the issue with the students rather than ignore it. By including this material, we were able to have a meaningful conversation about representation, the history of guest workers in Germany, racism and xenophobia, in a comparative context, and the German education system, which has long functioned to perpetuate and exacerbate class and racial divides. So while it is, of course, preferable to utilize materials that are inclusive and anti-racist by design, it is also important for students to learn how to confront and deconstruct harmful messaging that exists in the target culture, which ultimately forces them to do the same in their spheres of influence. So when we talk about, cultural competency, which has become such a buzzword, this can also be something that is, learning cultural competency in an anti-racist way. This also ensures that we are not teaching a whitewashed version of the cultures we are tasked to present in all of their complexity, the good, the bad, and the problematic. So in light of recent events, including the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Tony McDade, and countless other Black Americans at the hands of law enforcement, some departments and instructors and the ECLC have committed to addressing racism and other forms of discrimination in the classroom, in part by reflecting on and revising their own teaching materials and practices. Yet while this is crucial work, it is equally important to be sensitive to how such discussions may be targeting, triggering, or tokenizing for students of color, first generation low-income students, queer and trans students, and any other group that may feel marginalized by the material. So how can we reduce harm to marginalized students? How can we encourage respectful dialogue that fosters the growth of all students? In short, how can we work toward creating anti-racist, inclusive, and social justice-oriented classroom spaces? So below, I hope to offer some guidelines that will support instructors on this path. Begin by reflecting on your own positionality vis-a-vis the material and how your way of existing in the world has shaped your perspectives. If you identify with a particular marginalized group and it is safe to do so, disclosing your positionality can help to establish your credibility and personal relationship to the material in a way that humanizes the issue and may encourage students to reflect on their own stakes. Be aware too that if you are in a position to choose to disclose your identity or affiliation, this may be a form of privilege and protection that other visibly marginalized folks do not enjoy. So as someone who is often white passing, I do have that privilege, but I also do have the other side of the coin, right? So being mindful of those and sort of the dynamics that those create in the classroom. If you do not identify as a member of the group or groups in question, please be mindful that the work you do in your class does not serve to perpetuate the very exclusionary discourses that it ostensibly aims to deconstruct. As you design your course, consider the variety of perspectives available to students in the scope of your course and in the scope of your curriculum. So this is where also discussing with colleagues in your department it's really helpful. Make sure that you do not only use one person from a marginalized group as representative for the views of that whole group, which would be tokenism. Instead, include perspectives from non-white, non-native speaking, non-male, non-straight, non-cis writers and artists in every way you can, and not just tagged on to the end of a semester in order to fulfill like an idea of a diversity quota or something. Quotas are very helpful, but we can also think in more complex ways than that. Draw connections between, here I'm saying German speaking, but I think this would apply to anyone's field, between your own cultural context and local and global forms of marginalization, pointing out both similarities and differences. As you prepare your class sessions, try to anticipate the reactions of students whose identities are targeted within them and how your framing and intervention can serve to minimize the potential for violence done onto these students. Make it clear that students and instructors that are not a part of a particular community are not to use words that do harm to the people of that community, and establish censored forms beforehand. Become steadfast in calling out and naming things as they are. Call out racism as racism. While it is important to provide historical context for non-contemporary materials, do not excuse harmful views as merely products of their time. This goes also for anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, anti-queer, anti-trans, ableist, and classist sentiments. Offer trigger warnings, particularly for any scenes depicting violence. Model the stance of the learner you wish your students to emulate. Learn from your students. Respect their knowledge, remembering that although some students may lack the critical vocabulary to analyze experiences of discrimination in an academic setting, their life experiences should also be valued. But do not look expectantly to students whom you believe to be members of a marginalized group to perform victimhood in your classroom, or as we would say in German, Betroffenheit. You don't want to do this, right? Check in with students who shared personal stories after class and connect them to resources on campus to help them process that experience. Sometimes they will look fine leaving your class and then really experience something hurtful, and it's really helpful for you to check in with them afterwards. Address harm you or others have done, whether or not it was intentional, and take criticisms with grace, humility, and non-defensiveness. Do better when you mess up, and you will mess up. I have messed up. I forgot trigger warnings for a very, very violent, graphic, violent it was a video that was criticizing anti-Black racism in Germany, but I didn't offer a trigger warning. I hadn't taught it before, and I just assigned it. And it was really hurtful for my student. And so I learned from that experience. You will make mistakes, and that's part of the process. And it's also very important that you check in with the student who was hurt potentially from that situation. My experience as a student is not unique. It's shared by many of our students of color in our classrooms. And while I have referred to my own process, excuse me, of learning how to speak about oppressive structures, as well as studying articulations of resilience, joy, and ingenuity in defiance of these structures, the first part of my title, now I've already forgotten what it is, something I knew but couldn't name. It actually refers to something that one of my students said to me during our we had an oral final exam last semester. And they said, these are things that I had always thought about and that I kind of recognized, but I didn't know how to articulate it in quite this way. So giving students the opportunity to develop those languages alongside the languages that we are teaching in the classrooms is a really powerful thing, and something that they can take with them beyond that linguistic context, right? So I said I promised some resources at the end, and I'm going to do that. So I am part of the Diversity, Decolonization, and the German Curriculum Collective. And this organization has put together some incredible materials, including the volume Diversity and Decolonization in German Studies, which appeared this year. It was co-edited by Regina Kaiser and Erwin Malakai. And I have a review of this volume coming out for the next issue of a journal in my field. So if you want sort of like a short rundown of what it's about before you decide to read it, I'm happy to provide you with that. And it's just really fabulous. And I think that the advice in it really goes far beyond the German studies context and can apply to all of our fields. The DDGC blog is also a really great resource. We should make sure that the library purchases it. Yeah, if it hasn't already. I got a reviewer copy, so I didn't think of that, but that's a really good point. I'll check on that. So the DDGC blog is a free and accessible resource that also focuses on German studies, but I think that the advice in there also goes really further than the German studies context. For a general introduction to the need for inclusive teaching, one source that was really helpful for me is Claude Steele's Whistling Vivaldi, which addresses stereotype threat as it pertains to underrepresented students and explains how identity shapes a student's feeling of belongingness and perceived ability to succeed in the classroom. This is a book that we read for an inclusive teaching working group that I did in graduate school, and it was really helpful for us. There's also this great recent article by Paul Gorski titled Avoiding Racial Equity Detours. In it, Gorski deconstructs 4 common techniques used in predominantly white educational spaces that claim to attend to racial injustice while actually perpetuating it. So good intentions, not great outcomes, not great impact. And now I would like to note that Alexander Mendez, our kind colleague, has recommended these resources. So Alison Phipps's 2018 book, Decolonizing Multilingualism, Struggles to Decreate, and Suhanti Motta's 2020 article, Is an Anti-Racist and Decolonizing Applied Linguistics Possible? Which was published in the Annual Review of Applied Linguistics. There are also several websites with incredible resources to support anti-racist teaching in all disciplines, so beyond the language and culture classroom. The USC Library has created a really wonderfully useful anti-racist pedagogy guide, which is accessible from their website. And one of the really important tabs here that I want to point out is on pedagogy and whiteness, which is really crucial because we can't create anti-racist spaces without also questioning what whiteness means, how it operates, and how it's perpetuated within academia. The Brown University Harriet W. Sheridan Center for Teaching and Learning also has resources for inclusive and anti-racist. Yes, I will make these available, I will. The links won't work on the chat, but I'll be happy to send this file to anyone who would like it. The Brown Teaching and Learning Center has resources for inclusive and anti-racist teaching on its website, and emphasizes the importance of course structure and defining clear learning goals as being part of creating an equitable experience for all students. So some things that we do that are considered good pedagogy, a lot of things that we talked about during our wonderfully helpful ECOTS training over the summer, a lot of these things are also related to anti-racist and inclusive teaching. So we can be better instructors overall by committing ourselves to this work in different ways and how we structure our classrooms, similar to how universal design makes classroom space more accessible for all students. So this is obviously a really non-exhaustive list. So I encourage you also to seek out additional resources and communities of instructors in your own field to continue doing this important work. And as John mentioned earlier, this is also something that will be an ongoing project within the ECLC. So we will have initiatives in the future. Definitely stay tuned and get involved. I believe there will be a reading group next semester. So if you're interested, definitely participate in that as well. So in sum, learning how to be anti-discriminatory on multiple intersecting levels and ensuring this environment in your classroom is a form of language acquisition as much as it is a form of unlearning of the languages of oppression and marginalization that make up the natural grammars of our lives in discriminatory societies. I'm sorry for the linguistics joke here. Like every other language, becoming proficient in its structures and vocabularies take time, effort, and practice, but it's worth it. So with that, I am done. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your feedback.
Edom, thank you so much. That was incredible. And I will provide some commentary on your talk after our second talk today. Thank you so much for all you share with Emory and with the ECLC and your department, our students. I wanted to move on to Dr. Yi Wang. And Dr. Wang is a lecturer in Chinese language studies. She received her PhD from the Department of East Language Studies at the University of Arizona. As an applied linguist, she is particularly interested in the social and cultural aspects of language use and learning by transnational and multilingual students. Her primary research focuses on the multi-layered language ideology among nation states, stakeholders, and study abroad students in China in the age of Belt and Road. She is also interested in the process of third language acquisition of multilingual individuals. She has published articles in a number of journals and edited volumes. Prior to joining Emory University, she taught in the US, Australia, and China. Please welcome Dr. Wang.
Thank you. Thank you for the really warm introduction. And I'm gonna share my screen here. if you can see the slides. Okay, thank you for this opportunity to for this workshop. And I have to say that I really love the talk by Didim, which gave us really a lot of pedagogical suggestions and resources. So mine will turn the direction a little bit, although the title of this roundtable is called Anti-Racist Language Pedagogy. But I hope to use the next 20 or 15 minutes to talk about students' lived experiences in a multilingual study abroad context and how race might play a role in a colorblind society like China. So when we talk about anti-racism, a lot of research and focus on the US context. So I hope that this kind of students experience will give you open the discussion for our educators to talk about, to look at more like in a global perspective. So why should we care about China? So China has become one of the most popular study abroad destinations for US college students, and also worldwide for students from the One Belt and One Road countries. It's a colorblind society. Here, I only borrow the surface meaning of this term, meaning that in China, it's all kinds of different major policies. There's no particular racial aspects. But China does have its own ethnic conflicts. But usually, study abroad students in China end up in some big cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, where are the Han ethnicity-dominated communities. So if we further look at the racial composition of these study abroad students in China, the minority students are actually underrepresented in this community. So how do students of color, particularly Black students, navigate within their own study abroad cohort and also in this colorblind society? And how do Black students cope with racial conflicts and sometimes even open racism? I don't think I could give an exact answer to these questions, but I hope to share some results from the social network and ethnographic data and open the floor to our educators for discussion. So this particular study abroad program where I collected my data in spring 2019 has 30 students from 18 different countries. It's an English taught program while in the curriculum, Chinese language classes are required. So to most of them, both English and Chinese are their second languages. And this is a highly multinational and multilingual community. We have African students, Afro-American students, Afro-Brazilians. We also have South Koreans, students from Thailand and other South Asian countries. But this is still a white-dominated community. There are 18 Caucasian white students in this cohort, and they mostly come from Anglo-Saxon countries. In this talk, I will focus on two Black students, James and Dahid. James is from United States and Dahid is from South Africa. During my fieldwork, I observed that even though they are both Black students, they have different experiences in terms of racial issues. So James has studied Chinese language for 3 years before coming to China. He lived in a dorm with a Chinese heritage speaker who speaks fluent Chinese. However, his roommates did not really find out the fact that James could speak Chinese language after living with him for more than 8 months. So James chose to speak in English all the time. And Dahid is at a similar level of Chinese language proficiency. He joined a lot of clubs on and off campus voluntarily. And he has a lot of Chinese friends and he tried to use Chinese language all the time when he talked to the locals and the students in this program. So here's the overall picture of the language proficiency level of this student group. All of them reported they have intermediate high or above English language proficiency, and nearly 50 of them reported they have intermediate high or above Chinese language proficiency. So the study abroad research often looks at how students interact with the local community using the target language, but neglect the interaction and language use within the study abroad cohort. So using the social network data, I want to first talk about these two students, James and Dahid's language use and the interaction within the cohort. So here's a network that tracks student interaction in the cohort. The nodes here in the graph denote students, and the edges or ties indicate a pair of students actually frequently talk with each other at least once or several times per day. In this sense, the network tracks how frequently students interact with each other. So if you look at this graph closely, red circles indicate the 2 focal Black students. On the left side, let's take a look at James, an African American. You see that only 2 white students, Larry and Max, reported that they frequently talked with James. But this is a directed graph, meaning that we did not really see James reported he frequently talked with these 2 students or other students at all. So if we look at the heat on the right side, the Western African, we see that 1 South Asian student and 1 white student, Adrian, frequently talked with him. Again, we did not see that the heat reported he frequently talked with other students. So if we look at the whole network, the most popular students are Sophia on the right top, Farhan, and Stefan. So obviously our Black students are marginalized in this group, and they did not frequently interact with others. So here, now let's look at the average ties a student has, specifically the ties from the focal students sending out and receiving. So the number of ties directed towards others is our degree centrality. If a student reports that he or she talks with another student at least once per week, we see these 2 students are connected. So the left panel is a box plot of our degree centrality. The middle lines shows that the mean Y value. It shows that compared to white students and other racial group, Black students as a group have the lowest out degree centrality. It means that they reported they did not speak with students in cohort quite often. And the right panel is another box plot showing in-degree centrality. So the in-degree centrality measures the number of ties directed towards the focal student. It means that other students think they talk to the focal student frequently, and there was no substantial difference among different racial groups. So these results actually got quite interesting. Within this study abroad community, students thought they frequently interact with the other students equally, and there was no huge racial difference. But if we look at how they interact with others, students of color tend to think they did not have a lot of students to talk to. So let's zoom in and take a look at the detailed network. Here I plot the talking network as long as students report they speak at least once per week. So Lahid here talked with other students from South Korea and South Asian countries. He also interacted with James, but James had no students who he frequently spoke with. And if we look at the in-network for Lahid and James on the right, it seems that a lot of white students and South Asian students thought they frequently talked to James, which was the same case for Lahid. So again, there's a huge difference between out and in networks. I think it leads us to think about the gap between how students think they're interacting and how they're actually interacting in daily lives, and the existence of systematic racism even in this multinational study abroad group. So let's take a further look at the internal community of how students closely interact with each other. I use the community detection algorithm to partition all students into different subgroups. Here we have 3 major subgroups in this community. Zahid on the green group here falls into the group with other students from South Asian and other developing countries. James falls into the group with white students. And so far, we did not really distinguish the languages they use when they interact with each other. So now let's take a look at the network speaking Chinese, the target language for these students. Here we only focus on the interaction if one of the students reported he or she used Chinese when they spoke with each other at least 5% of the time in the interaction. So the size of the edges is proportional to the percentage of time using Chinese. For example, we can see that Ploy and Jiahui here speak Chinese when they interact with each other for most of the time. So interestingly, our Black students, Zahid and James, actually did not often speak Chinese, although their Chinese proficiency levels are above the average of the class. Farhan reported that he sometimes spoke with the Heat using Chinese, but this was not the case for James at all. And now let's finally move to the friendship network in the cohort. We asked students to rate friendship closeness with each other. On the left side, you see the whole friendship network. The size of the edges also proportional to the strength of the friendship. James and Nahid were actually embedded in the network with students from South Asian and Southeastern Asian countries. And white students tend to be friends with white students. If we zoom in and see the friendship network for Nahid and James on the right, Nahid thought he had a couple of friends, including Asif, Sophia, Farhan, and Hanjun. And he also had a couple of white friends such as Yuna, Theodore, and Adrian. But keep in mind that these students actually are quite popular in this cohort as well. And James seems quite isolated. So now I hope to talk a little bit more about their experiences in the local community using the ethnographic data. When I was there collecting data, they had been already studying in China for 8 months. First, let's take a look at James. In the interview, he explicitly expressed that he encountered many instances on racial discrimination. As I mentioned before, he'd rather not using Chinese language in interaction, but chose to emphasize on his national origin and identity as a native English speaker. On his WeChat, on the right bottom here, it's a social networking platform that is really popular in China. He used the flag of the US as part of his ID. And he said, this way I may get an intern opportunity. He understands that being Black may reduce the chance of getting an internship, but being American may increase his likelihood. So here, let's look at how James described his feelings in China. When James talked about studying, hiring, and working situations, he felt racism is higher in China even than in the US. This is because of racial discrimination instances he had encountered. And in the previous slide, he had some difficulty getting an internship because of the skin color. And that is why he was emphasizing his national origin instead of his race. James also pointed out the potential mechanism leading to open racism in hiring. Shanghai is an international city and employers can have more access to foreigners. So what kind of foreigners can they access? Obviously, it is predominantly white foreigners. That means those employers tend to hire white students instead of students of color. And that is the underlying logic of being selective. He said they have more access to foreigners, so they can be more selective. So this statement points out the open racism he encountered and acknowledged the white privilege in China. And what are some of the consequences of racism for our students like James? Such experience actually led to the result that James hid the target language ability and did not want to speak Chinese language within the cohort or in the local community. He did not want to engage with any local activities and went back home immediately after completing the coursework. So I want to point out such open racism is not rare. For instance, these students have received part-time job posting asking for German only to stay at the exhibition. And they further asked about the requirement and got answers that German face would be fine or Westerners would be given priority. And here, the German face and Westerners actually are indicating Caucasian whites. So when James talked to one of the teachers about this, the teacher replies that you have to lower your expectation, which also normalized the open racism and made James feel frustrated during his time in China. So the Heat, on the other hand, had completely different experience compared to James. Although it seems that they were both marginalized in the study abroad cohort, Zahid managed to engage in local communities using his Chinese language proficiency. He said his proficiency of Chinese language become a signifier that he likes and respects the country and the language, so people are willing to make friends with him. He acknowledged the racism in China. However, he said China is a better place for Blacks compared to other countries. And Zahid was very active in participating in local activities. When I was doing my fieldwork, I actually went to the martial art club with him. I saw that he had a good relationship with the locals. And this picture was taken when he was practicing martial arts with locals. So the big question is why these two students have distinct experience and feelings about China. I don't think I can provide the exact answer yet, but this definitely needs further research in the study abroad context. So here, let's provide some by-sided explanations. How do other students in the cohort see racism towards students of color? This might provide us some hints. Some white students told me that Chinese are only racist towards Blacks, and I'm not Black, so it didn't happen to me. And they enjoy the white privilege of being a white foreigner in Shanghai. For instance, they can get drinks for free in clubs, but their Black friends encountered racial discriminations. They could go inside, but their friends have to stay outside. And these instances once again tell us that study abroad students of color are marginalized and the victims of open racism, even that China is quote unquote colorblind society. So obviously this is not the reality. So let's look at some major takeaways I hope provided from this study. You see that study abroad students actually replicate the social interaction pattern in their home countries. Network data tells us that racial segregation exists inside the study abroad community. White students tend to play with white students and minority students tend to stick together. Second, white students enjoy some privilege of being foreigners in Shanghai, but students of color encountered racial discrimination in terms of hiring and other social activities, both in the cohort and in the local community. Third, even for students of color, the experience is different. James and Nahid had different feelings about China. I think it's also linked to political ideologies as well and their national origins as well, which needs further research on that. So finally, what are the implications for us, especially for our language educators? First, as I said, China is a colorblind society, and this has something to do with its ethnic composition. So they have no colorblindness training, even in the higher education. So what should we do to address this issue? As program administrators, we need to develop some anti-racial discrimination training programs to train our program staff, faculty, and employees hiring in a foreign country to be aware of the intercultural differences. Also, how can we improve the curriculum in the study abroad program? For instance, a lot of study abroad programs have the component on socializing with locals. How could we incorporate some modules to train our students to avoid potential racial conflicts? Finally, we see that our students are segregated. As language professionals, what can we do about it? Can we design some classroom activities to break this racial segregation within the study abroad cohort? So I think we still have a lot of work to do, but here's a picture I took from the site. Probably we could start from having less photo examples when we talk about financial managers, and it's all Caucasian white who can be financial managers. So it's just an example I took from the site. So yeah, thank you. I will stop my share here. Kristen, I think you are muted.
Excuse me, I don't know how that happened. Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. This was another really important and enlightening presentation. I feel as though Dr. Yuzhou and Dr. Wang have really helped us begin this conversation. It's an important one, and I love the juxtaposition between what basically what it's like as a student who experiences racism and how we as professors can bring, what kinds of things we as professors can do to help our students navigate this and learn the language. And Didem, you brought up that fact that it's not only that they're going to learn the language that we're teaching, but also learn those subtle languages, the language that's invisible, that is around the language that we've learned and we've internalized, but oftentimes we don't speak about. How do you learn that? How do you even learn the language to express the racism that you've experienced as a minority? You know, that is something that often we don't teach, but I really appreciated the way Dr. Yuja really talked to us about how when she started taking German, she was able to suddenly learn the language for her own experiences. And I agree completely. That is one of our jobs as language teachers, not only to teach the language and the grammar, but the cultural DNA that goes along with that grammar, the DNA that's not always explicit. And not only does that include the subtle ways the foreign language communicates to each other, but also those subtle, you know, those subtle moments of, or those subtle indiscretions, or racism itself, or how is that communicated, and how can we have a language to talk about those experiences if we are from a minority? If we're not, how can we become more compassionate, understanding, and more aware of those subtleties? And I thought that was a really important part of your presentation, as well as a number of pieces of advice, including reflect on your own positionality in relationship to the material, just disclose your own identity when appropriate. As you design your course, have discussions with colleagues to make sure you don't use one person to represent one group, and never approach these discussions in a superficial manner. I really appreciated your saying call out racism as racism, because oftentimes as teachers, we're not sure how to navigate this. And we want to have compassion for our students who are unaware of the mistakes that we made. But calling it out doesn't mean that we don't love our students, that we don't care about them. It's just saying this isn't appropriate. Let's find a different way to talk about difference in a respectful way that does not include racism. Offering trigger warnings is important, learning from your students, and never singling out students who fit identities to represent their identity. You mentioned a number of resources as well. And so I love that you mentioned connecting students to resources after sharing personal information. That's often quite traumatic and difficult. Discussing when we all make mistakes, and it's important. I agree with you, Didem, that it's really important when we make a mistake to acknowledge it and say, we're human. This was not okay, and here's why. And that's very important to stop and do that. And so as far as Dr. Wang's presentation, I really feel as though these two presentations were excellent complements to each other, because Dr. Wang actually took us abroad and showed us in a study from an academic viewpoint, but also from the point of view of two Black students, especially one, what it was like to study abroad. But looking at the big picture, you acknowledged that we have a responsibility to do this work, even if it's difficult. And then you talked about how China, although being colorblind, or at least claiming to be colorblind, that it's an anti-Black, it does engage in anti-Black racism. And how do we as educators navigate this, especially if we don't have the same identities as our Black students? Dr. Wang shares a study utilizing her fieldwork, the fact that a lot of study abroad programs are white dominated, that there is racism within the group, and oftentimes Black students feel ostracized or not included in discussions within the group, even if the group thinks that they are interacting, or white students believe that they're interacting in the same way. with everybody. It's not really the case. And it's also interesting that you brought up how in China, Black students interacted with Chinese residents and people from China who were racist. So you mentioned one thing, well, a lot of things that I thought were really important. But one thing, reactions of professors to the actual racism is important. And we can do a lot of damage too if we don't act in an appropriate manner, or if we don't give the situation enough weight. And I think that's really important. So you concluded with develop anti-racial training for the program itself. And I assume that's for the students as well as staff and the community in which the students find themselves, turn training into color awareness rather than color blindness, and doing a lot of inclusivity training. I think that there's a lot that we can learn from both of these presentations about what we can do as educators. You know, just becoming aware of the differences. Maybe we're not aware of the differences, and it takes a bit of self-reporting to say we're not feeling included, or you didn't go up to bat for me, even when maybe as educators we think we did. And one thing that I feel is common with both of these presentations is that we need to listen to our students. We need to listen to our students of all identities and make sure that they're heard, especially when a microaggression or something that is racist does happen. And so I'd love to open up the discussion now to our group and hear what you've gleaned from the two presentations, where we go from here as the ECLC as an organization, and how these two presentations can help us move into action, and also any questions that you have for our two amazing speakers who I believe they've brought so much light to this topic, and also created a really good foundation for us to continue these conversations. So without further ado, I open this up to you. Thank you. So oh yes, Narjis?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So one of the things I was curious about from both Didam and Yi was the, how do you separate, and I'm sure there are different answers for both of them, but I'm curious in terms of, you know, the colorblind that you kept talking about of China, and how do you separate color racism versus other forms of racism in many of these societies where one is very dominant, right? And that's why the white skin. So a lot of the Asian countries, at the risk of generalization, are overtly color racist among themselves as well, from the north to the south of the same country. So how do you separate that for students and see what becomes, so the further question would be in terms of then internalizing part of that color racism, but not necessarily the other aspects of racism, right?
Thank you so much. Great question.
So I don't know if I can answer this really complex question, but I can give a little bit of context, which is that Germany also imagines itself to be a colorblind society. And a lot of this is due to the impact of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, where discussing race is really tied to Nazi race ideologies. So the topic of race is thought to be a taboo. If you talk about race, you are inventing race, and therefore you are racist. So a lot of this color blindness is very detrimental, because how do you talk about racism if there is no race? And that's why a lot of the ways that race is talked about in Germany is through importing concepts from English language scholarship, oftentimes to the extent where the experiences of people of color in German-speaking countries is then ignored because it's like, well, at least we're not as bad as the Americans. So it's sort of imagining racism to be a foreign problem because we don't have race here. We solved the race problem after World War II, so that's not a thing anymore. And over there in the US, we're not as bad as they are. That's where the real racism happens. So discussing American racism in a way that it is not seen as related to anti-Black racism and other forms of racism happening in German-speaking countries. There has been more of a development in terms of awareness of police brutality and racism within German-speaking societies since the summer. So there were also huge demonstrations for Black lives in Berlin, in Vienna, in Zurich. There were these ginormous demonstrations, which is so wonderful to see. And it was interesting to hear why certain people were marching. Some people were marching out of solidarity with the US, which is obviously wonderful and fantastic, but then not acknowledging also the racism happening in their own country. And then there were Black Europeans and people of color in Europe who say, hey, by the way, this is also happening here. We've been trying to tell you about this, and you've been saying we don't have racism here. So I think also just, that's why I pointed out that it's important to talk about both similarities and differences, because we can use concepts from the North American context, theoretical concepts, methodological concepts, in ways that are really fruitful to be employed to non-North American contexts, but we really need to be mindful of where the lived experiences of those who are in those societies are being ignored, and where it becomes not a one-to-one representation or a one-to-one comparison, which is where the really exciting work happens, right? So I think that's why it's also really important that the that the college is making this requirement for race and ethnicity as part of the curriculum. I think it's going to help all of us in all of our classes, because with a sort of shared, hopefully shared understanding of these concepts across the board, we can really delve into comparative work in our classes as well. I don't know if I answered your question, but basically colorblindness is a huge problem in Germany as well. So Yi, would you like to continue?
Yeah, I don't think I can answer the exact questions, but just China probably would be a little bit more different than German, because China is a non-immigrant country. And what I mean colorblind is that there's no discussion about racism or race like what Dylan described. And also there's no any policies talking about anti-racism or something like that in the discourse in China. So however, we see that like I was doing language ideologies and political ideologies when I conducting this data collection, but color racism is actually something that's so salient in my data, and it's something that I cannot really bypass when I talk about ideology, and yeah, I think I don't know if I can answer your questions, but it's and especially for this student study abroad student group, I feel it's really interesting because they come from all over the world, and they brought up their own ideologies and their own views about race towards this cohort. So that's why I feel like it's really important to look at this, and yeah.
Thank you. So I'm so sorry we don't have any more time to answer questions. It is exactly 5 p.m. But I'm wondering, Dr. Yuja and Dr. Wang, would you mind sharing your email addresses in the chat just in case people have other questions?
I'm also happy to I'm also happy to not to volunteer anyone else's time, but to stay on a bit longer if other people have questions, because this just flew by. I wrote my own name wrong, so hold on, let me do that again. It's Uja, by the way. Uja.
Yeah, scusami. This was a great discussion, and I really do think you started us in a really wonderful direction, and can't wait for the next one. But we'll stay late in case anybody wants to continue the discussion.
I spelled my email wrong again.
For coming too.
I'll get it on the third try. My name part is correct. Just the comma should be a period. Sorry about that.
I was wondering if you collaborated with the study abroad program to get this to gather this information.
Yes, I actually conducted a 6 months ethnographic work at this program. So I basically act as a researcher and a student, and went to every course and all the social activities I can with all this group of students. Yeah. And for the social network data,
Franca, you had a
yes.
Yeah, sorry, but I think you were still talking, right? I don't want to.
sorry.
Okay. I just want to mention that for the social network data, it was a complete social network interaction questionnaire collected from the students at the beginning of the ethnographic fieldwork and at the end. So, yes.
Thank you, Yeast. My apologies. I think my connection went dead for a moment and it sounded like you stopped speaking. I'll hand it over to Maria Franca. You have a question.
Yeah, sorry. This is probably a little bit tangential or marginal question about trigger warning that was mentioned by Didem, because I personally have very mixed feelings about that. So for example, I just actually typed in, sorry, it's kind of a lengthy quote, but this is a trigger warning I recently encountered when I was browsing through the Norton Anthology of World Literature, and sort of like as a trigger warning before the one of Aristophanes' plays, Lysistrata, right? So I don't know how you say that in English, but in any case, it's a comedy, right? Very racy and bawdy. And so, so you see, like, it ends up by saying those who do not want to encounter bad language ought to steer clear of the play. I don't know, that doesn't sound to me like a very, like a good advice. So how do you actually do trigger warning in a productive way? When do you use trigger warning?
Yeah, so I think trigger warnings is something that I've talked about so much, or I've been in conversations where this has come up for so many years. So I have also a lot of thoughts about it, and a lot of sort of confused, oh, I could see this and I could see that sort of thoughts about it. But for me, I think it's really important to give trigger warnings when there are scenes depicting violence, particularly sexual violence or racial or violence that is happening to the person due to their identity factors. So in this example that I mentioned, there was an attempted lynching, essentially, of the character in this short film that we watched, that the students had to watch for class. And I had, a Black student in that class who said, I really didn't need to watch this attempted lynching for homework last night. Like, you could have told me that this was happening, and I could have either chosen to watch it or not chosen to watch it, which is 100% completely valid. So I think the trigger warning is to protect students for whom the content is related to trauma. It's not to protect students from engaging with materials outside of their comfort zone or things that are challenging. Even things that are upsetting in general, right? It's really to offer students, and you don't know what your students' traumas are. You can't predict that either. There could have been a white student who had a Black best friend who experienced that, and that might have been very triggering for them to read about. So, you can't really make those assumptions before. So that's why, I think this is kind of a sort of frivolous trigger warning, but if you have material that uses racist language or depicts racialized violence, I think that would be an opportunity to provide. So it's not about it being bawdy or bad language, right? It's about the N-word comes up in this play, and for whatever reason, you're not able to censor it in your copy. So please be advised that this language comes up, and we will not be using this word in my class. So it's about giving students the opportunity to opt out of things that will be really harmful to them. That's the goal for me, not shielding them from adulthood and being, exposed to things that are outside of what they would have seen in their high school class. That's not really the point.
Thank you so much. Great question. Any other questions? Yes, Mizuki. We can't hear you though. I'm not sure why.
Okay, sorry everybody, is this better now?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question to Yi. I found your study fascinating, and I think China and Japan are somewhat similar. That now there are many non-Japanese people visiting or living in Japan, but traditionally Japan has been rather homogeneous country, and the racism do exist in Japan. My question to you is, how do you advise your students before they go to China? It might be study abroad or something else, knowing that they may encounter racism, and how do you prepare, or what would be your advice to these students? And you discovered that in case of Black students, there can be good situation or bad situation. And it has been my experience too with my students, that it's sometimes Black students do not have as good experience as white students. At the same time, I also led study abroad program, and I observed that there were two Black students. They were from Trinidad, but anyway, two Black male students, as well as white students. And in that particular case, the two Black students' experience was at least as good as white male students' experience. They were happy every day. They came to talk to me. They told me how many new phone numbers they received from girls and all these happy things they shared. But at the same time, people or students of color can be discriminated or feel not welcomed by Japanese people. So once again, my question is, how do you prepare your students before they go to China?
Yes, thank you for the question. Actually, what I did before for study abroad program, because this program I did not really design it and do it as one of the faculty. I just conducted research for that. But what I did before for study abroad group programs, and I actually designed orientation or pre-study abroad workshops to talk about. I don't want to like single the racist problem out in the workshop, but I will talk about critical instances that students, not just about racism, but students who study abroad might encounter. So I would talk about like critical instances and ask students to share what they will do under such circumstances if they encounter such kind of situations. And so this is one strategy that I think students kind kind of help the students to adjust the expectations, and because students have imaginations, a lot of imaginations before they go abroad. So I think this kind of practices help students engaging in thinking about what does it mean to study abroad, and also know from their peers' opinions as well. So that's one strategy I used before. And also, I actually, when I led study abroad program, I actually had students encountered such kind of racism, and also white students talk to me, they don't like the positive racism they have encountered in China, because they don't want to be treated as special, and they don't want to be like stalking by people just because they're white. So for this kind of situation, I think it's all depending on the faculty during the study abroad. And it's for me, I did a one-on-one to talk about these experiences, and didn't just said share our positionality with the students and our experiences with the students. That's what I did for previous study abroad program. But I'm sure there are more that we can do and we can think about doing in the future. I hope that answers your question.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. Alexander, you have a question.
Hi everyone, thank you so much. These were really, really helpful for getting our community at Emory to think about these really important questions. So thank you very much, both of you. I was really struck in both of your presentations by how the phrase non-native was used, or native or non-native was used. So Didem, you use this in things that you're talking about, things that we can incorporate to show this kind of diversity. And Yi, in your presentation, this student wanted to sort of foreground his native English speaker identity rather than a racialized identity. And so I've typed out my question because I don't know if it makes any sense. I'm going to put it in the chat. Could you comment on the ideological distinction between native and non-native in our work, and as it might relate to anti-racism and diversity?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, so thank you for pointing this out. It's something that is really interesting in the German context too, because so in Germany, there's this idea of the German studies that happens in German-speaking countries, which is the real German studies, and then the Auslandsgermanistik, so sort of the foreign German studies. And part of that is an outsized focus on issues of multilingualism, you know, transcultural, transnational experiences, basically all the things that I work on that don't really happen very much in the German-speaking context. And so there is a fetishization of the native speaker that happens in Germany, in German-speaking countries, and also in the US and in US German studies here, right? We want to teach our students to speak like a native speaker. Well, which native speaker are we talking about? What is the class? What is the race? What is the gender of that native speaker? What is the region that they're coming from? So this in and of itself is a very problematic concept. But does that mean I'm not going to correct the adjective endings on in my student's essay? Probably not, unless I'm very behind. So it's something that we grapple with, I think, as language educators, and so much of it seems so natural to us that of course we want our students to speak like native speakers, but what does that mean? So I think bringing that awareness into our discussion is really, really important. For me, part of my intervention with that is, and maybe this isn't really sufficient, but I try to incorporate, yes, I'm going to call them non-native German speaker writers and cultural producers, not in a unit on non-native German speakers, but in various aspects of the curriculum. If we're reading poetry that week, why don't we read a poem, like normalize it, like that? And that doesn't mean ignoring the aspects that they're bringing up in their work and in a colorblind way, right? But to normalize it, plus talk about those aspects. And if you're reading 3 plays, why are they all by white German men, right? So also when we're thinking about diversifying and being more inclusive in our curricula, to draw from non-native, whatever language speaking communities to really be a significant part of that, of our curricula, rather than just being like a one-off. And I found this to be a really, really effective strategy for motivating students who realize for the first time, like, wow, I could actually be a creative writer in that language. I could move to that country and be extremely successful. I could, it opens up the world for them so much when they see people who grew up speaking another language, then, being so successful in that context and creating incredible art. So I think pointing that out hopefully isn't doing, that they are non-native speakers, and saying like, hey, sky's the limit. You can do this too. This could be your name on this book next year. Why not? Or 5 years from now.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think as a language educator and applied linguist, I'm definitely not really a fan of using non-native and native binary. And because for multilingual speakers and using translanguaging practices. So, but it definitely relates to the racial problem we are talking about, because like the case James in my study, he emphasizing his nativeness as speaking English. However, when he encountered problem of finding teaching English as an intern, he actually could not compete with a German student who does not speak English as the so-called native language because of the racial, the color scheme, so skin color. So so I think it's really interwoven together, and it's really important for us to look at how students think about and perceive the binary concepts. Yeah, I don't know if I answer your questions, but from my standpoint, I definitely not in support of this binary concept.
Mm.
Yeah, as a heritage speaker also of Turkish, I've always had a complicated relationship to this native, non-native thing. And when I was teaching English in Turkey, this was exacerbated to comedic and tragic ends, where my Turkish students didn't think that I was as much of a native English speaker as the other American instructors from Fulbright. So it was, it's such a fraught, and it can become a very, very emotional topic, I know, for heritage speakers such as myself. So I think it's really important that we continue being really mindful of this. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
And also one thing I find is really interesting is when I do the questionnaire, I ask the students report their own language proficiency. And it's really interesting to see how they define their language as near-native and native. And the student asked me, what does native mean? Like if I'm a heritage speaker, Italian, Chinese, am I native or not? So I think this definition definitely have a lot of flaws and have a lot of problems. And the students actually be aware of that as well. So yeah, it was very interesting conversations with the students as well.
I just wanted to make a point on Alex's question on the native and non-native. I think it also has major implications, and perhaps Christine is suggesting a workshop where we could explore how that also ends up into the very fraught area of racism, right? So, what natives of a certain language see as racism within their own language and culture, that a non-native sees more of a breadth. And there are disagreements even among pedagogues about when you're giving instructions for study abroad. It might actually be offensive for the native speaker when you bring up certain aspects of that culture as preparing the students for racism. And it can become offensive amongst even the pedagogues, right? So I think that intersection of the native with the races is an important one to explore.
And also who has access to being able to say they are a native speaker. Like Eve, when you're talking about in your presentation, I've also encountered so many times in the States where people have said to me, oh, well, your English is so good. And it's like, thanks. Was born this way sort of thing. So, you know, even a student's name or a student's cultural heritage, they might not have they might be denied that native speaker status, which is also why I think maybe that student was using it as sort of like a banner of, hey, I'm the real deal, right? And I really understand that impulse to do that, because that was also certainly the case for me. Has been many times that people assume something about my identity and you know, say I have such a great accent. I'm like, thanks, I'm from Long Island. Like, I don't know what to tell you. So I think when we think also about native language, we also need to think about the privileges that are interwoven in that. Yeah. So when a minority student claims to be a native speaker of something, that maybe says something different than, just it's very much tied with identity in very fraught ways.
Yeah. Any other questions? No. I'd love to hand it back to the ECLC director, Jonathan Master, maybe for a few closing words. This was fabulous.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. Thank Didem and E and Christine for leading this. That was really informative and wonderful and energizing. And I just think it shows the passion for the subject that, I really, Dan Walter asked about, syllabus, possible workshops. And like, I was saying the other day, maybe that's not till next year, but maybe we got to go back to just doing that in the spring. But anyway, I want to assure everyone that we're going to keep going with this, and I think it's going to make us all better language instructors and people. Maybe even some of us will be better people. But anyway, thanks so much, and have a good evening, and we'll see you soon. Yeah.
Bye.